you, Eduardo. That was wonderful. Let me also say my thanks to Alex and Laksu, the students and the programs of Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies, Chicano Latino Studies, Native American Studies at UC Berkeley for supporting today's event. It's truly an honor to be here. Hearing Ron Tataki's name, brought up a lot of what they say in White Chicken Skin. It's like a great, I think, mind, and it's wonderful to be here to speak in places that his work rests. I also wanted to say that I am pleased to be sharing the stage here with such distinguished colleagues and in the audience, on the panel in the audience. And as Locke was reading my bio, I thought, all I really do is seem to send and answer email. So all of the other things don't seem to matter. It just seems I am always sending and receiving email, and it's nothing else. But let me just repeat this phrase in one sentence, because I like to say it, because it wasn't a possibility so many years ago. That those programs of Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies, Chicano Latino Studies, and Native American Studies, ethnic studies, especially to say that here at Berkeley, where a generation of students and activists refuse to learn America through a monochromatic lens, and for some of you in this room, taking that fight to fight for tenure as a hallmark of progress, so that you're quote-unquote bona fide, or institutionalizing our experiences. I'm not naive to think that campus politics and injustice doesn't continue to exist. But as director of the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Studies, it's a wonderful thing to say, because I feel that the work that we've been doing, that the reasons why we have an Asian Pacific American Center, or Smithsonian Latino Center, a National Museum of African American History and Culture, a National Museum of American Indian, is because of these kinds of social movements that were born here, those kinds of acts of resistance, that long history of cultural activism by people of color. So it's wonderful just to repeat that phrase, because I said a generation before us, that wasn't necessarily going to be a possibility that people could register for those classes, or and for some of us even have an opportunity to go to school. So this is to say that I view the movement and my work as part of this larger movement, one that views institutions of culture and learning, universities, museums, archives, libraries, arts and film organizations as being part of the civil rights journey. That these things ought to serve the cause of social justice, and that issues and those issues of representation, inclusion as they relate to the national narrative. And I feel this is especially of concern when we consider what we call national institutions, those ones supported by public funds, that purport to be, being of the people, by the people, and for the people. The fact that we talk about the proposal to build a National Museum of American Latino, and Eduardo said may not make it the news out here, but the proposal has such ramifications because it means it is supposed to come from the people and our tax dollars and all the like, and if we embrace that as a good. So I just wanted to say it's great to be here, because I see what I do as a continuation of going eastward, something that started westward. Do the next slide. We went through one rehearsal, so hopefully we'll do this, but I appreciate it. So that's me, but not me in the picture. But people want to have sort of contact information of how to get a hold of me. But I highlight this slide and the one before it, just as a homage to the labor movements that brought together Filipino Americans and Latino Americans, Larry Itiong and others, and that mural that many of you may have seen in, here on the West Coast. But as a transition to the kinds of work and images that I will showcase of the work that we do. This one's from the Beyond Bollywood exhibition that Locke had mentioned. It's one that looks at the experience of America through the historic culture of Indian Americans, so people from South Asian Indian descent. And I like this picture just because it sort of juxtaposes the nation with this look of ambivalence, a sense of feeling when you look at him in this either pride or sort of ambivalence of how he feels about being in this country, wrapped in this country, and ultimately a love of this country. And the one sort of feeling I want to leave with you, because I'll return to this, is that notion of feeling unfamiliar. And so if you come to this, there's a sense of dissonance with how you would feel with this picture. So the Asian Pacific American Center was established in 1997, and like the social movements I mentioned that established ethnic studies here at Berkeley and other places, the center was founded in activism. So people like Norman Mineta and Daniel Inouye, that's his registration card, and I think his story is well known. So these leading public servants in the Asian American community argued that the experience of Asian Pacific Americans were not represented across the Smithsonian institution. They wrote this report, and this is in the late 90s, that declared that the historical, quote, the historical contemporary significance of our presence in the United States is largely absent from the Smithsonian's collections, research, exhibitions, and current planning. And a commitment to Asian Pacific Americans by the Smithsonian, they wrote, would improve the Smithsonian's standing as the agent of America's rich heritage and improve the public's appreciation of the crucial roles that Asian Pacific Americans have played in the United States, and simultaneously empower Asian Pacific American communities in their sense of inclusion. And since then, that's been our vision, to enrich and empower, as well as to serve as this national resource for discovery, because when you discover, it's because you didn't know it before. And the notion of consequence and complexity of trying to untangle the ways in which we understand Asian Pacific American history, art, and culture. And we do this through exhibitions and digital programs and the like. Now I want to sort of bring that down into something more, what does that mean in practice? Now, traditionally at the Smithsonian, which some people think is, it's been with us for about 150 years, for the most part, it's kind of been the kind of Hall of Fame of America, right? And you sort of embrace the American story without any sense of ambiguity or unfamiliarity with the things that have gone on in this country. And so our view is not to treat the Asian Pacific American experiences exclusively as this immigrant tale, right? Whereby once you're included in the national narrative, you become America's ideal citizens, which again is what the Smithsonian would want. Rather, I think our commitment, as I believe, is to render the American experience unfamiliar in ways that, as I would put it, decolonize the national imagination in a way that allows for different kinds of voices that Eduardo had discussed earlier about this notion of decentering. So that notion again of unfamiliarizing, making things unfamiliar, to try to decolonize and associating those two, and again just returning to that image that I shared earlier as a first illustration. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, throughout my career, one of the things that I've tried to do is etch some of the things I've learned in school, paid some tuition for and paid that off, is how critical theory can be translated into curatorial practice. And I've tried to do that across my work in film, in museums, and then here at the Smithsonian. And one of the sort of early works that influenced me was a guy that I think was probably published before some of you were born, was Homi Bhabha in this book called Location of Culture. And one of the things that he was looking at was in his post-colonial cultural studies was his exploration of those cultural discontinuities, right, that manifest in efforts to nationalize colonial populations. So the notion that when a colonizer takes over a colony, there's a need to try to syncretize the notion of how that piece of property, how those people belong to the nation. So there's an effort to nationalize these colonial subjects, but without empowering them. So there's a dissonance at work happening there, because you are part of the United Kingdom, yet you're not a citizen of the United Kingdom. You're not, in other words, you're not reflected in the canonical ways that represent the country. You are its subjects, its colonized population. And so I thought about Bhabha because I think about the Asian Pacific American experience and at the Smithsonian because we're underrepresented and excluded from those quote-unquote canonical ways that represent the country that purports to be our nation. Now, Bhabha discovers this critical dynamic that I want to bring into that curatorial practice, that notion of unfamiliar, right, of trying to assimilate the colonized into a national patrimony while trying to preserve as well as dissolve those differences that come from that exercise of colonial power. That basically the colonized is asked to mimic this performance of being a citizen without avoiding the same privileges or authorship of the national canon. So you're incorporated in the national culture, yet you remain distinguished without noting the differences between rulers and the ruled. And so I think this is an interesting argument about how we understand Asian Pacific Americans. They're kind of the same, but different. We have a history, but it's not our own. And that goes on to feed a lot of stereotypes that I think some people have studied in this room and otherwise. And it's a way in which it allows to have a space for a museum to occupy. So for me, the task of representing Asian Pacific Americans at the Smithsonian is to somehow think about the performance of the nation, the National Museum, and its subjects as being incomplete, as having a sense of dissonance, a sense of unfamiliarity for those who actually are able to author the canon of America. So again, it's to advocate for the inclusion of Asian Pacific Americans, but again in a way that opens up a critical space. So what does this mean, in practice in some of the projects? Okay, so let me. So one of the shows that we did was Portraits for Now, Asian American Portraits of Encounter, and I think that Eduardo and Locke had mentioned this. This is our first real partnership with the National Portrait Gallery, whose mission is to, quote, tell the history of America through individuals who have shaped its culture, through the visual arts, performing arts, and new media. The Portrait Gallery portrays poets and presidents, visionaries, villains, actors, activists, lives who tell the American story. So it is, again, a kind of a Hall of Fame. Right? It's a Hall of Fame and approach to telling America's story. And one of the ways to make that unfamiliar to people is to try to think about the American story from a different way. So are we going to think about America, next slide, through George Washington crossing the Delaware, that famous iconic image that is, looking at the birth of the Revolution, our republic, the American spirit, the element of exceptionalism that defines this country. We're going to start with that, or we're going to select with Roger Shimomura crossing the Delaware. And Roger Shimomura, who is reflected in the shadow, some of you may know him. He's a Japanese-American artist who works in this kind of medium. And one of the things, as a son of a Japanese-American intern who was interned, someone who spent the majority of his life in Kansas, was one who always felt alone, always felt marginalized. Yet the things that he did find reflected in his experience were through cartoons that tended to be stereotypes and the like. So one of the things that he wanted to do was to put himself as George Washington. And some people may think about this as an act, again, of great patriotism, right? I am as American as George Washington. But then he also populates it with the kinds of stereotypes that frequent the American imagination, that Eduardo said. When we think of the Smithsonian Asian Pacific America, we may think of the Freer-Sackler Gallery, which is a wonderfully rich Asian collection of China, of Korea, back in the turn of the century, during the Tang Dynasty. So those kinds of stereotypes continue to haunt his embrace, and our attempt to defamiliarize Washington crossing Delaware with Roger Shimomura crossing the Delaware. Okay, next slide. So again, this show, we included 7 artists. This is another project, the Sijo's project called the Kyoko Project. Kyoko is a Korean word that means Korean overseas. That while you may not be born in Korea, you will always be Korean in a particular way, which is a little different from how other kinds of ontologies of Asian nations take the life, where you're maybe diaspora, but you're not really kind of a national citizen. Well, in Korea, it's a little different. So one of the things that Sijo wanted to do was take portraits of Korean Americans without essentializing what it meant to be Korean Americans. So she picked a whole bunch of them. There's like 40 to 50 photographs, and he asked them just to come dressed as you are and to take your pose, and I will take your picture. And taken as a totality, you try to think, well, what is it about them that brings them together? What is it about them that separates them? Can you actually tell that they're Korean American or not? So again, making, by the sheer volume of subjectivities that represent this uniform experience, you make people unfamiliar. Another show, this was a great artist, Shizu Saldamondo. She's a wonderful person that we included in our Asian Latino show. One of the ways in which she wants to do is weave in experience. We invite her to be part of this heritage project, but one in which she feels that, well, my heritage is in the people that I know, and the people that she knows and where they live. So she takes a lot of street art and found objects and composes, this one's entitled Charms Proofs of her friends, who happen to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer subjects. So she links an experience of Asian Latino, Asian Pacific American, and art in such a unique way. And so she has a series of these portraits where there are people doing karaoke, and they're hanging out on the streets, and they occupy kinds of ways in which Asian Pacific Americans aren't traditionally represented. in those, again, those stereotypical ways. Another one, there's another artist called Satomi Shirai. This one's called Laundry. And she photographs portraits of her daily life. And again, this show is called Asian American Portraits of Encounter. And again, we're trying to make people unfamiliar with that concept, to question and to walk away from what it means to be Asian Pacific American in a Hall of Fame, in an institution known to be telling a Hall of Fame story. This one's by Zhang Chunheng. All she does is hair. And what's wonderful about this is this piece is that hair in particular cultures like Chinese culture has a mythological kind of standing, and I think that's true for other cultures. Yet at the same time, she chooses not to portray her subjects, right, in the kinds of ethnic, cultural, or racial ways in which her work is supposed to speak to, and in which the show was supposed to speak to. And so we chose again a way to make it unfamiliar for people, to try to engage with a way of being that wouldn't necessarily jive with stereotypical ways of understanding. Okay. So another way that we're attempting to decolonize the national imaginary is to make this notion of digitization unfamiliar. Now, the current trend in museums, and I think this is true for like what they call the digital humanities, has been to see digitization as a priority, kind of the exclusive focus of technologies and social media to broaden public access, to enhance engagement with the public, and improve archival collections and management. So at the Smithsonian, this book was written by the secretary of the Smithsonian, a guy, or generally it's a guy because we've never hired a woman, that leads the Smithsonian. And this is his, and I say that because I'm surprised. 140 plus years, it's unfortunate. The Smithsonian Institution has made this massive effort and investment to digitize a vast collection in which the experiences of Asian Pacific American communities and their participation in forming the national patrimony is largely absent. So there's a concern that this commitment to digitization is broadening access to a collection that is otherwise incomplete, and devoting resources to it while not also enriching it at the same time, and yet that falls under the good of, well, it's enrichment, it's enhanced. And so one of the ways we want to do is defamiliarize that notion of digitization in collections, what has happened in digital humanities, is to suggest that this approach affirms what I would say a racial ontology, right? That pieces are collected throughout the history of the Smithsonian during times when subjects, such as the ones in which we represent, and the communities in which we are here in this room, were not valued or seen as part of being part of the American story. And so the Asian Pacific American story is the outcome of that, and that's why we have so little in terms of what we can highlight and present. So now collections can grow. I can take that we can take that for granted. But one of the things we want to do is how we want to render this unfamiliar is to argue this, that we believe that digitization and the use of digital media is not about broadening access per se. That takes for granted that people of color use digital media the same way as other people. We want to say they don't. We want to say that digital media space has been a space where people of color, communities of color, indigenous people, have used to create a space of their own. Because if they are not reflected in institutions that would otherwise find them undervalued or invaluable, they would be able to use digital media to create the spaces of meaning for themselves. So that's what we want to try to do, is decolonize that approach to digitization. And so this actually happens at a time when, and there's just a series of articles here, that Asian Americans are actually becoming a social force on social media. We happen to be some of its most popular users, most popular channels on YouTube. We happen to, if you've read this book on the rise of the creative class, that nearly half of the Asian American population participates in the culture workers that is called America's Class. This is a book by Richard Florida. That range of artistic, scientific, technological, educational, professional, that world of culture, design, and entertainment. So we're part of one of these big drivers of American popular culture, and it's being reflected through the Asian American experience. So our point is to then, what that means for the centers to make things unfamiliar is to then showcase our work online, and doing it in ways that are through born digital kinds of media. So one of the things we did was we had this great exhibition called, well, I thought it was great, the I Want America, Why American Earth, which tries to tell kind of the canonical understanding of the Asian Pacific American experience through an exhibition. And we also put it as a comic book. So we recruited leading Asian American comic book artists, and we took these stories. We said, what would you say as if the Asian, the Japanese American experience of internment was a comic book? How would you represent that story? And again, comic books have been wonderful, right? They're part of the American canon. And yet, when we see Spider-Man, and we see him as played by a man who's not black, not Latino, not Native, not Asian. But if he was, people would be like, why did you cast him? He's not Spider, he's not Peter Parker. It's not Peter Chow, it's Peter Parker. So one of the things we want to do is reoccupy and make unfamiliar the kind of canonical ways in which America has been represented. So these are, again, this is about the pathway to citizenship, Wong Kim Ark, some of the ways in which we, Asian Americans, have been part of America's legal story about making citizenship and affirming the Constitution and its amendments to say that citizenship is for all. Another one, Vincent Chin. There was a hate crime in the mid-'80s. That's one that helped bring together Pan, Asian, and Pacific American social movement in Detroit. Okay. So another one we want to do is challenge Asian New Year, right? So Lunar New Year, which I think for a lot of people tends to focus on typical ways that we understand. So it's this particular animal. You have a dragon. You have lots of firecrackers. And, I think those are terrific interpretations of heritage. But we wanted to broaden it and to look at how, in a way, in the born digital online media memes, how we celebrate different kinds of Lunar New Years and New Year's right now. So this is one which is true. The 1940s is another way to do it. We circulated the It's Admiral Matthew Perry, not the Canadian Matthew Perry. But again, making a way in which we make unfamiliar the ways in which it's time to celebrate Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year, different ways in which you want to approach it. Another one. Okay, one of the things we wanted to do too as well is that this is our story, the Asian Pacific American story we see, as same as Eduardo does, as intersecting with other ones. And we take what we take to be iconic figures of the American story. So for example, Martin Luther King. And we try to put it into the perspective of America's Asian Pacific heritage. And it turns out that Dr. King visited Hawaii. He went to Hawaii, one of my home state, a place that I love, in 1959. And that was the year that Hawaii, a state that is predominantly Native Hawaiian and Asian Pacific American, lots of people there. So there's a lot of cultures, a lot of races, a lot of tension, as well as sort of different ways in which people have lived together for decades. And he went there to say that it's a great honor to be here because he feels that Hawaii and its multiracial background, the ways in which it's had problems and challenges and he's worked to address them, can serve as an example for America. So in many ways, Martin Luther King is an American icon, but he's also one who we can say is an Asian Pacific American one. And we did a digital exhibition during Martin Luther King Jr. where we traced his visit to Hawaii and then to India to speak with Gandhi's family to learn about the non-violent movement in terms of social activism. So again, taking that part, I'm sorry, can we return back to the other slide? I know we didn't rehearse the reversal. So, and if you see up here, he's wearing a lei in Hawaii. He's wearing a lei there as he landed in Hawaii. And this is the march in Selma to Montgomery. And he's wearing lei there as well. And that's there as well. So while he was taking place in this iconic and important event in America's civil rights story, he was wearing a lei from Hawaii. Because Hawaii had reached out to him and had sent a delegation that the kind of struggle for civil rights is not one that's just for African Americans, it's for everyone. And so that we've been part of that. Another digital, so that's our digital initiative in a digital exhibition, tracing his roots through across Asia. Okay, next slide. Another project we did, and I'm going through kind of the ways in which we've done these online, is the Young Historians Living Histories Project. This is one where we worked with museums across the country to work with their education programs to reach out to young people who we would consider underserved or under-resourced youth and educators to learn about Asian Pacific American history and culture in the local communities. And I wanted to next slide, share this because there's a series of videos that these high school students produced, and the ones in which they made unfamiliar, again, Asian Pacific American understanding. So we're going to do this really quickly. So this is one. Is the sound? That's right. So this one right here, this top one that's playing, is entitled Pacific Islanders in America. So again, when we think of Asian Pacific Americans, we sometimes neglect the role that Pacific Islanders have been. So we focused and reached out to these Pacific Islanders and how they have come to the United States. And in this story, which is great, this man was a stowaway. He just hid in a boat and went to America. And that as being a different part of the quote-unquote immigration story. Can you play the down below? It'll just stop there. This one's a stop, history of the internment in 30 seconds. This is a stop motion one, which is great. This kid just decided to break down the basic elements of the Japanese-American internment. And one of the things that he wanted to do here was make unfamiliar how Japanese-American experience has been told through almost a parody. And the way in which he's done it is to also make it unfamiliar not just for the public, but for Japanese Americans. So that one's great. We'll go to the top one. This one, yeah, the sound's unfortunately not playing. So this one is a wonderful one that we discovered. So we went to South Carolina, Greensboro, South Carolina, and we worked with the Montagnard, I'm always mispronouncing it. They're indigenous refugees from Vietnam, or the Degar youth. And this is their story. And this is just such a wonderfully unknown story for Asian Pacific Americans as we understand Vietnam. And so working with this small community, being able to teach these kids media skills, digital media skills, to speak in a language that, again, speaks to a different way of digitization. You can't really collect this object. Right? So that's part of our role, is to make that unfamiliar. We'll go down. Thank you. These guys are great. They did a spoken word, which unfortunately we can't really hear, but they just wanted to question, where is Asian America? And they were speaking loudly about trying to go with the stereotypes they experience and then rooting that into their life. So I just want to quickly wrap up just with a few other things that we've been doing. The one is the one that we've been working on, again, is this notion of unfamiliarity is not just for non-Asian Pacific Americans. It's not just for non-Asian Pacific Americans. It's actually for Asian Pacific Americans alike. So that we're able to root our experience through the experience of others, doing that through Martin Luther King as well as Latino communities. This is a project that we did with Eduardo, where we did an Asian Latino Intersections Festival, where we wanted to do an exhibition but without a museum. And so we did that online and in a pop-up fashion. So we had a series of works that we commissioned from artists who were Asian and Latino descent or lived in Asian Latino communities, and we asked them to share a piece of work that gives an interpretation, again, making a sense that that's unfamiliar. Another one. This was great. This is by Culture Strike. One of the things about Culture Strike is they wanted to reframe the notion of migration. Right? So part of the debates today about immigration, citizenship, or undocumented workers, it's always in the negative. And one of the things they wanted to do was put it in the positive by saying migration is beautiful, that the movement of peoples to one place to another is one in which we should embrace and celebrate and put in an aesthetic manner. And so again, putting together different kinds of faces and figures that are part of the migration is beautiful. It's a lowrider rickshaw. Love that. So again, that speaks to culture that we're all familiar with between Latino and Asian communities. Okay. So we did this pop-up exhibition where we took these works, we produced it as a set of playing cards, we put it as a catalog that was online, and then we projected it in Silver Spring, Maryland, on walls, on different spaces. We set up our booth, we talked about the project, and we invited as many people as we know. And it was an amazing sense of community. So again, taking that notion of what digitization means and making it unfamiliar, making it embracing its sociality as opposed to enrichment through making more objects accessible. So we also did an online exhibition, and we took a look at the Asian Latino experience with food, with its gourmet intersections, focusing on different ways in which the Korean taco has been represented. again. And one of the things, to reoccupy our imagination and to make unfamiliar the role that Asian Americans, Asian Pacific Americans play online. And that's the work of the Asian Pacific American Center at the Smithsonian, to make unfamiliar, in many ways, America. Right? Because I think that the study of Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians, Indigenous people, African Americans, Latino Americans, the study of those people, the representation of these communities in our institutions of culture should really be an examination of character, the character of our nation, and especially as they relate to social justice, as I started off with. And here I just want to make one pitch. I'm making a corollary argument here about the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, the Smithsonian, and more generally, cultural organizations such as museums, libraries, and archives. If you're committed to the critical thing, if you're committed to the role of critical thinking and to critical theory, and you're unsure of what you want to do, here I'm speaking to students, mainly. If you're in graduate work or you're unsure of professional schools like law schools and the like, I'd like you to consider museums as a form of work. Because this kind of reorientation that Eduardo's engaged in, and I'm engaged in, Sven's engagement that we're studying, is one in which requires these kinds of passionate activists who see cultural work as a service and civic duty. And the truth is, I think this is what those students and activists were thinking back in 1969 when they were occupying offices here in Berkeley, saying that we needed to decolonize our learning. We needed ethnic studies. And let me say, we need museums. And we need people like you to be able to help do the work that I feel has been part of this long tradition. Thank you very much.